My name is Sarah Kim Anderson, and I'm writing this from Seoul, South Korea, where I'm spending 6 months trying to reconnect with the Korean culture that was systematically erased from my life when I was adopted by well-meaning white parents who believed that love was enough to overcome racial differences and that raising me to be colorblind would protect me from racism and cultural confusion. At 27, I'm finally learning to use chopsticks properly, struggling to understand basic Korean phrases, and visiting the orphanage where I lived for the first 18 months of my life before being brought to Minnesota to grow up as the only Asian person in my adoptive family and community. The journey to reclaim my cultural identity has been painful and necessary, forcing me to confront the reality that my parents' colorblind approach to transracial adoption left me psychologically and culturally unprepared for the racism I would face and the identity questions that would consume my adult life. I was adopted from Korea in 1997 when I was 18 months old by Tom and Linda Anderson, a white couple from Edina, Minnesota, who had struggled with infertility for years before deciding to pursue international adoption. They chose Korean adoption because they had read that Korean children were healthy, intelligent, and adapted well to American families, information that reflected positive stereotypes about Asian adoptees but revealed little understanding of the cultural and psychological complexities involved in raising a child whose racial and ethnic background differed dramatically from their own. My earliest memories are entirely white and American: birthday parties in suburban backyards, Christmas mornings around trees decorated with Scandinavian ornaments, family vacations to cabins in northern Minnesota, where I was always the only Asian face in family photos that documented our seemingly perfect all-American life. My parents never discussed my adoption as anything other than a blessing that had brought me to the family where I belonged, and they actively discouraged questions about my birth parents, Korean culture, or the circumstances that had led to my placement in an orphanage. The colorblind parenting philosophy that my parents embraced was considered progressive and loving in the 1990s, based on the belief that emphasizing racial differences would create problems where none needed to exist, and that treating me exactly like a biological child would protect me from feeling different or excluded. They enrolled me in dance classes, soccer leagues, and school activities just like any other suburban Minnesota child, never acknowledging that my Asian appearance made me visibly different from my family and community in ways that would affect my social experiences and identity development. The cultural erasure was complete and systematic. No Korean food, language, holidays, or traditions were incorporated into our family life. When I asked questions about Korea or expressed curiosity about my birth parents, my adoptive parents would redirect the conversation toward gratitude for my American opportunities and remind me that dwelling on the past wasn't healthy or productive. They meant well, but their approach effectively communicated that my Korean heritage was something to be overcome rather than celebrated, and that my identity should be entirely defined by my adoptive family's culture and values. The first experiences with racism occurred in elementary school when classmates would make comments about my weird eyes, ask why I didn't look like my parents, or make stereotypical assumptions about my intelligence and cultural background. When I came home upset about these interactions, my parents would dismiss them as isolated incidents from ignorant children and assure me that race didn't matter in our family or community. Their well-intentioned colorblindness left me without tools for understanding or responding to racism, and I internalized the message that discussing racial differences was somehow inappropriate or harmful. The identity confusion intensified during middle school and high school as I struggled to understand my place in social hierarchies that were increasingly organized around racial and cultural identity. I was too Asian to be fully accepted by white classmates, too culturally white to connect with the few other Asian students in my school, and too disconnected from Korean culture to have any authentic understanding of my ethnic heritage. I felt like I was performing whiteness while looking Asian, creating a constant sense of imposter syndrome that affected my self-esteem and social relationships. The dating challenges during high school reflected broader issues with racial fetishization and cultural disconnection that would continue throughout my adult life. Some boys were attracted to me specifically because I was Asian, apparently expecting me to embody stereotypes about submissive Asian women or exotic foreign culture. Others seemed confused by my appearance combined with my completely American cultural references and behaviors, as if my Korean features should somehow be accompanied by accent, cultural knowledge, or personality traits that matched their expectations about Asian women. The college years at the University of Minnesota provided my first exposure to other transracial adoptees and Asian American students who could help me understand that my experiences were not unique, but rather part of broader patterns affecting adoptees who had been raised without cultural connections to their ethnic heritage. The Asian American Student Organization invited me to cultural events and social gatherings, but I felt like an outsider who couldn't participate authentically in conversations about family traditions, cultural values, or shared experiences of growing up in Asian households. The therapy that began during my junior year was motivated by depression and anxiety that seemed connected to unresolved questions about identity, belonging, and cultural heritage that I had been discouraged from exploring throughout my childhood and adolescence. Dr. Jennifer Park, a Korean-American psychologist who specialized in adoption issues, helped me understand that my struggles weren't personal failings but predictable responses to being raised without cultural mirrors or preparation for navigating racial identity in America. Transracial adoption creates unique psychological challenges when adoptive parents don't address cultural identity and racism, Dr. Park explained during one of our sessions. Children need to see themselves reflected in their families and communities, and they need tools for understanding and responding to racial discrimination. When adoption erases cultural heritage, it can create lifelong struggles with identity and belonging that affect mental health and relationships. The decision to search for my birth parents was complicated by my adoptive parents' resistance to acknowledging that I might need connections to Korean culture or biological family to feel complete. They interpreted my interest in birth family as rejection of their love and parenting, and they worried that opening adoption records might lead to painful discoveries or relationships that would threaten our family bonds. Their fears reflected their own insecurities about transracial adoption rather than consideration for my emotional needs and identity development. The birth family search process took 2 years and involved working with Korean social services, adoption agencies, and genealogy researchers who could navigate the complex legal and cultural systems involved in locating birth families. The search revealed that my birth mother, Park Ji-hai, had been a teenage single mother who surrendered me for adoption because she lacked family support and economic resources to raise a child. She had never married or had other children, and she had been waiting for over 25 years for any contact from me or information about my life in America. The reunion with my birth mother was emotionally overwhelming and culturally challenging, requiring translators and cultural mediators to bridge language barriers and different expectations about family relationships and emotional expression. She was overjoyed to learn that I was healthy and successful, but she was also devastated to discover that I couldn't speak Korean, knew nothing about Korean culture, and had no understanding of the family history and traditions that she had hoped to share with me. The guilt that emerged from the reunion was complex and multifaceted. Guilt about my adoptive parents' reaction to my birth family contact, guilt about my birth mother's sadness over my cultural disconnection, and guilt about my own anger toward the adoption system that had prioritized my adoptive parents' comfort over my cultural identity needs. The reunion forced me to confront how much had been lost through cultural erasure and how difficult it would be to rebuild connections that had been severed for over 25 years. The Korean language learning that began after the reunion was frustrating and emotional, requiring me to approach Korean as a foreign language rather than reclaiming a mother tongue that had been taken from me. Adult language learning is difficult under the best circumstances, but trying to connect with birth family and cultural heritage through laborious translation and basic vocabulary felt inadequate and heartbreaking. I was mourning not just the language I had lost, but the cultural knowledge, family relationships, and sense of belonging that fluency might have provided. The cultural education process involved consuming Korean media, reading about Korean history and traditions, and connecting with Korean American communities that could provide mentorship and support for my identity exploration. But learning culture as an adult felt artificial and performative compared to the natural cultural transmission that occurs within families, and I struggled with imposter syndrome about claiming Korean identity when my knowledge was so superficial and recently acquired. The family therapy that eventually included my adoptive parents was necessary for addressing the hurt and misunderstanding that had developed around my birth family search and cultural exploration. My parents had to confront how their colorblind parenting approach had inadvertently harmed me by ignoring my racial identity and cultural needs, while I had to acknowledge their genuine love and good intentions even as I grieved what had been lost through their parenting choices. The advocacy work that emerged from my experience includes speaking at adoption conferences and working with organizations that promote culturally competent transracial adoption practices. I share my story to help prospective adoptive parents understand that love alone isn't sufficient for raising children whose racial and cultural backgrounds differ from their own, and that cultural preservation is crucial for adoptees' psychological health and identity development. The professional work I've developed focuses on post-adoption services and support for adult adoptees who are struggling with identity issues and cultural disconnection. Many adoptees experience similar patterns of depression, anxiety, and identity confusion during their 20s and 30s as they begin to process the impact of cultural erasure and racial isolation they experienced during childhood and adolescence. The ongoing relationship with both families has required careful boundary setting and emotional management as I navigate competing expectations and cultural differences between my Korean birth family and white adoptive family. Both families want exclusive emotional loyalty and can struggle to understand that I need connections to both cultures to feel complete, even though my relationships with each side are necessarily different and complex. The Korean cultural learning continues through language classes, cultural immersion programs, and relationships with Korean Americans who can provide mentorship and community support. The process is slow and sometimes painful, but it's also healing and empowering to reclaim aspects of my heritage that were taken from me and to develop authentic connections to Korean culture that aren't dependent on others' approval or understanding. Today, I work as an adoption social worker who specializes in preparing families for transracial adoption and providing post-adoption support for families dealing with cultural identity and racism issues. I advocate for adoption practices that prioritize children's cultural needs and prepare adoptive parents to support their children's racial identity development and cultural connections throughout their lives. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Adoption organizations that specialize in culturally competent transracial adoption provide pre-adoption training and post-adoption support that addresses cultural identity and racism preparation. Therapy with culturally competent providers who understand adoption trauma and identity issues helps adoptees process cultural disconnection and develop healthy relationships with both birth and adoptive cultures. Adult adoptee support groups provide peer connections and shared strategies for dealing with identity confusion, family dynamics, and cultural exploration later in life. Birth family search services help adoptees navigate the complex legal and emotional process of reconnecting with biological families and cultural heritage when they're ready for that journey. Cultural education programs for adoptees provide opportunities to learn about heritage cultures through language classes, cultural immersion, and community connections with people who share their ethnic background. Family therapy services help adoptive families address conflicts around cultural identity and birth family relationships while maintaining healthy family bonds and communication. Advocacy organizations work on adoption reform that prioritizes children's cultural needs and promotes practices that preserve rather than erase ethnic and racial identity. Educational resources for prospective adoptive parents help them understand the long-term impact of transracial adoption and prepare them to support their children's cultural identity development throughout their lives. Today, when I meet other transracial adoptees who are struggling with cultural disconnection and identity issues, I tell them that their feelings are valid and their cultural exploration is necessary in healing, regardless of how their adoptive families react. You have the right to know about your heritage and to develop connections to your birth culture, and the loss you feel about cultural disconnection is real grief that deserves acknowledgement and support. The journey to reclaim cultural identity is difficult but worthwhile, and there are communities and resources that can support you in developing authentic connections to your heritage while maintaining healthy relationships with your adoptive family.